This is lecture 18, and it's the first of 4 lectures on Melville's Moby-Dick. Moby-Dick is probably, and I think properly, seen as the premier American novel. It could be the most important piece of American writing that we have. It's a book that everybody knows about. People salute it. They genuflect before it. Not a lot of people read it. It's very long. It seems exotic to us now, a book about whaling. And so, in some ways, Moby-Dick is a kind of odd quarry. That is to say, it's a book that is wonderfully respected, but not much really examined. And that's a great pity, because it's one of the most exuberant, playful, lively, fun books that we have in the canon. In this lecture, this first one, I'm going to talk about how Melville comes to Moby-Dick, the kinds of changes that take place in Melville's thinking as he writes this book. And then I'll talk a bit about the remarkable narrator of this book, Ishmael, and the fraternal theme that's so important in the book. And then later, in subsequent lectures, I'll move on to some of the aspects of whaling and, above all, of the central tragic figure, Ahab. Melville did not start with Moby-Dick. Melville published a novel in the 1840s called Typee, which overnight made him an established, well-known, and eagerly sought-after writer. Typee is an account, essentially, of Melville's own adventures. It's an account of his shipwrecked experiences in the South Seas, and it has to do with a kind of sort of narrative of native life in a Rousseauist vein. That is to say, a kind of critique of civilized culture by dint of talking about the way these natives lived. And people loved this book. This book was a bestseller. And it's an interesting book because, for the most part, it's a very cheerful account and a kind of ongoing, gentle satire of civilized American or New England life versus the ease with which the body is understood, particularly among these natives. The big threat in this book, and it sort of looms over it just as it is in Robinson Crusoe, is of cannibalism, that maybe there's a very sinister underside to this life here of ease and pleasure. Melville can really be thought of a bit as a 19th century missioner, a person who was thought of as a writer of adventure stories, of yarns, a man who had been a sailor, who had been shipwrecked, who had a lot of first-hand information to recount. Typee is one of those cases where success plays you false. Later in life, Melville said that he became known as the man who lived among cannibals. And he regretted this enormously because he had larger fish to fry, as it were. He had other kinds of things he wanted to talk about, but it's as if his reputation sort of enclosed him, imprisoned him. This was what the public expected of Melville. I mentioned the cannibal issue because you're going to see that cannibalism remains a frightening but very compelling notion for Melville, but it's going to undergo a sea change. It's no longer going to be thought of in the literal way that it begins. Melville continues to write sea stories after Typee. He writes bigger and bigger, sort of more and more inflated and sprawling sea stories that have more and more doses of metaphysics and philosophy in them. Mardi, Omu, books that people really have much trouble reading. White Jacket, which is a more sort of straightforward, realistic account of being a seaman. And then in 1851 comes the masterpiece, Moby-Dick. And with Moby-Dick, Melville loses his audience. That this is the book that essentially we see as the greatest novel in the 19th century, if not of all, in American literature. But the contemporary readers had more trouble with it. That some liked it. It did get mixed reviews. It looked good considering what happened to Melville afterwards. I mean, he really loses his public after Moby-Dick. We know that Moby-Dick began in Melville's mind as a kind of romantic text about the fishery, about the whale fishery. And it was supposed to be outfitted with sort of glamorous, dashing characters, Byronic characters, a kind of gloomy, sinister captain. And that in the writing of it, something changes, and that we really know what that something is, and it's worth spelling out, particularly given the kinds of writers we've talked about in this course. And the something is the encounter with Nathaniel Hawthorne. First, an encounter via reading that in the middle of the 19th century, in 1850, Melville reads Hawthorne seriously, and he publishes a very well-known review, well-known to us today at least, of Hawthorne about Hawthorne's mosses. And in this review, what he signals as most important for him in Hawthorne is what he calls the power of blackness. And it's as if in Hawthorne he begins to see that there are layers, philosophical layers, moral layers that a fiction could have, that beneath and beyond the adventure yarn could be something else that you'd want to get into. The power of blackness in him, he links it to the puritanical tradition, the Calvinistic tradition, and you can sort of hear the gears begin to turn, that this is going to be something that is going to operate on his own sense of himself as a writer. He celebrates Hawthorne. He says that Hawthorne is our great American writer. He dwarfs writers such as Irving and others. He compares Hawthorne very boldly to Shakespeare. And in some of the commentary on Hawthorne, we, as I say, hear a kind of prescient sense of what Melville himself is going to do. In a letter he writes to Hawthorne in 1851, he says this, and he says it to Hawthorne: "There is the grand truth about Nathaniel Hawthorne. He says no in thunder, but the devil himself cannot make him say yes. For all men who say yes lie, and all men who say no, why, they're in the happy condition of judicious, unencumbered travelers in Europe." It's a very weird analogy. People who say no are like travelers in Europe, unencumbered. They cross the frontiers into eternity with nothing but a carpet bag. That is to say, the ego. So by saying no to convention, to custom, to routinized ways of thinking, even to ethics and morality as they're usually understood, you achieve a measure of freedom that is also a measure of mobility. This is what allows you to move across the borderline into eternity with nothing but your carpet bag of ego. And frankly, I'd have to look very far to find such a figure in Hawthorne, but we know just where he is in Melville. This is going to be Ahab. You can begin to see what's coming here. Likewise, Melville has an astounding and very, I think, sort of sad sense of his own speeded up development, the sense that he is coming to fruition at exactly this moment in his life, and he can feel that the end is not far away either. He says, my development, again in a letter to Hawthorne, my development has been all within the last few years. I'm like one of those seeds taken out of the Egyptian pyramids, which after being 3,000 years a seed, and nothing but a seed, being planted in English soil, it developed itself, grew to greenness, and then fell to mold. So until I was 25, I had no development at all. From my 25th year, I date my life. 3 weeks have scarcely passed at any time between then and now that I have not unfolded within myself. But I feel that I am now come to the inmost leaf of the bulb, and that shortly the flower must fall to the mold. It's an astonishing sort of organic metaphor about his own sense of coming to maturity, to fruition, to the plenitude of his own gift, and sensing that this is very soon going to fall into mold, which, in terms of his public reception in American culture, is very much on the mark. That's not all. There is in his review of Hawthorne and in his letters to Hawthorne a kind of a pathos that is, I think, very much aligned to his very poignant sense that this man could be a soul brother, that this man moves him, Hawthorne. I feel that this Hawthorne has dropped germinous seeds into my soul. Here we get that same organic metaphor, the inmost leaf I have come to, but these germinous seeds dropped into my soul. It really does have a sexual cast to it. He has dropped his seeds into my soul. He expands and deepens down the more I contemplate him. And further, like I'm being plowed by this man, he's going deeper and deeper into me, shoots his strong New England roots into the hot soil of my southern soul. And in a letter, you get the same sort of tonality, that this man is not just a soul brother, but there is a kind of intimacy, a kind of seeding, a kind of insemination of sorts. Whence come you, Hawthorne, he writes him? By what right do you drink from my flagon of life? And when I put it to my lips, lo, they are yours and not mine. I feel that the Godhead is broken up like the bread at the supper with a capital S. This is the Eucharist imagery here. And that we are the pieces, hence this infinite fraternity of feeling. I shall leave the world, I feel, with more satisfaction for having come to know you. Knowing you persuades me more than the Bible of our immortality. I don't think Hawthorne reciprocated this. I think Hawthorne was probably a bit frightened by the heat, passion, and need, hunger, that Melville expresses. That Melville expresses, I think, to his own astonishment in this encounter. And the reason that I wanted to say these things about that connection, I'm not usually interested in biographical details of this sort, is that it illuminates one of the central impulses in Melville's work, which is a kind of fraternalism, a kind of intimacy between men, usually, that is so powerful that it simply overrides most of the categories that we have that normatize these things, where we would say, well, we know what that is. Friendships in Melville are usually more than friendships. There's a very powerful homoerotic dimension to Melville's work. And this is always exploited narratively. It has to do with people telling stories, with men trying to understand other men. Well, as I alluded already to the fact that this sense of the metaphysical quest, the sense of the traveler who moves unencumbered into eternity with his little small carpetbag of ego, this works its way into the novel. This accounts for the astonishing figure of Ahab, who essentially usurps the novel. He takes on more and more power and authority. He fascinates, he paralyzes his own author in some way as the book continues. That's one of the changes. He stops being the picturesque figure that Melville initially had in mind, and he becomes, the term Melville twice uses is sultanic, becomes a figure of grandeur. But of course, he's not the person who starts the book. The book starts with Ishmael. Ishmael is the man who is going to render Ahab in some sense. And there's a very classic kind of narrative arrangement here. And we'll see it again when we get to Fitzgerald, that Nick Carraway is there to render Gatsby, just as Quentin and Shreve and Absalom are there to render Sutpen. You've got a larger-than-life figure, and you've got others who are like us, ordinary people, who are trying to somehow take the measure of this figure. There's a wonderful kind of narrative energy at work there. And so Ishmael is the person who ushers us into the book. He is the spectator in some sense of the scene. He has a flavor, however, all his own, and it's one of the most, I think, delicious characters in literature. I said that there's something sort of exuberant, I'd like to say fruity, about Melville, that there's a sense in which there's a tonality to his characters that it literally makes you salivate. I'm going to read you, this is one of the most famous opening passages in American literature. Call me Ishmael, first 3 words. How many books do you know that start like that? Call me Ishmael. You can virtually feel his hand on your shoulder. Call me Ishmael. Here is brotherhood, fraternity, crossing over the bounds of what narrative is. This is the bond between a reader and a text. Call me Ishmael. Some years ago, never mind how long precisely, having little or no money in my purse, reference I think to Iago there, and nothing particular to interest me on shore, I thought I would sail about a little and see the watery part of the world. It's a way I have of driving off the spleen and regulating the circulation. Whenever I find myself growing grim about the mouth, whenever it is a damp, drizzly November in my soul, time of life I think we can identify with, whenever I feel myself involuntarily pausing before coffin warehouses and bringing up the rear of every funeral I meet, and especially whenever my hypos, which is when he gets his fits of depression, whenever my hypos get such an upper hand of me that it requires a strong moral principle to prevent me from deliberately stepping into the street and methodically knocking people's hats off, then I account it high time to get to sea as soon as I can. Therapeutic. I've got to get there. I'm getting ready to cause a lot of trouble to folks. This is my substitute for pistol and ball. With a philosophical flourish, Cato throws himself upon his sword. I quietly take to the ship. There's nothing surprising in this. If they but knew it, almost all men in their degree, sometime or other, cherish very nearly the same feelings towards the ocean with me. Notice the way it closes. It closes as it universalizes it. Nothing strange here. All people share this sense of what the sea does for me, this watery part of the globe that I'm going to go down to, that I need to sort of regularly in order to readjust my system, in order not to give in to my hypos. As he says that all men need to do this if they but understood it, we see how far we have come from Taipei. We're into Moby-Dick now. This is no longer a yarn. It's no longer an adventure story. It's about personal needs. It's about my adventure resonating for you, for all men. I go to the watery part of the globe because I am having a response that is a universal response. And here is how I deal with it. There's a jauntiness, to call me Ishmael, to this figure. And I think that Ishmael, as I think I indicated in an earlier lecture, his own sort of, not quirkiness, but the bounciness, the brashness of this character has linked him to that tradition that I've called the Bahoy tradition, the sort of the tough, the stalwart kind of figure whom we're going to encounter again in Whitman's own persona. So Ishmael introduces us to the boat, the Pequod, and also to the people on it. And the people on it are described in an interesting way. Melville calls them an anarchist Klutz delegation in a very well-known passage, and this is that mixed group of people who came in at the time of the French Revolution and represented all sorts of folks who were now clamoring for their political rights. And that's what this fishing whaling boat is going to be. It's going to be a kind of sailing piece of democracy. It's going to be a multicultural vessel. It's going to be a place that has people from all over living on it together. This is Melville's experiment in democracy. He wants to tell us a story about all these people somehow getting along together on this boat. Very clear kind of political allegory that is stressed over and over in this text. The first character of real interest whom we meet after Ishmael, whom Ishmael meets, is the native Queequeg, who will be one of the chief harpooners and one of the very wonderful characters of this novel. And here, too, we can measure how Melville is leaving Taipei, the adventure yarns, the missioner persona, to become Melville. This happens at the Spouter Inn where Ishmael is staying, and he gets there so late there's no room. They've only got one room, and there's already somebody who's signed up for it. And he doesn't quite know much about this guy. He doesn't know who it is. And he has to share a bed with some figure he's never seen. All he knows is that he's a harpooner. And then this figure comes into the room, and he says, "Such a face! It was of a dark purplish yellow color, here and there stuck over with large blackish-looking squares. Yes, it's just as I thought. He's a terrible bedfellow. He's been in a fight, got dreadfully cut, and there he is, just from the surgeon." But at that moment, he chanced to turn his face so towards the light that I plainly saw that they could not be sticking plasters. At first, he thought these were just bandages on the guy's face. No, all those black squares on his cheeks, they were stains of some other sort. At first, I knew not what to make of it. And then he starts thinking about people who've fallen among the cannibals and have been tattooed. But what to make, then, of his unearthly complexion? That part of it, I mean, lying round about and completely independent of the squares of tattoos. So he's got this weird complexion in addition to the tattoos. To be sure, it might be nothing but a good coat of tropical tanning, but I'd never heard of a hot sun's tanning a white man into a purplish yellow one. And then this strange figure pulls out a tomahawk, and he gets a little worried. And then, of course, he gets into bed. Well, this is enough to, I think, worry even a very strong man. He doesn't know, of course, that there's anybody else in the room. So he gets into bed and he discovers that Ishmael's there. Who devil you? You know speaky devil, I kill ye. And so saying, the lighted tomahawk began flourishing about me in the dark. Landlord! For God's sake, Peter, coffin, I shouted. Landlord, watch, coffin, angel, save me. And the landlord rushes into the room and says, don't be afraid now. Queequeg here wouldn't harm a hair on your head. And it's that point that Queequeg stops being this exotic, picturesque, threatening devil, and Ishmael begins to settle in and focus on this guy. What's all this fuss I've been making about, thought I to myself. The man's a human being just as I am. He has just as much reason to fear me as I have to be afraid of him. Better sleep with a sober cannibal than a drunken Christian. Vintage Melville. Better sleep with a sober cannibal than a drunken Christian. Landlord, tell him to stash his tomahawk there, or pipe, or whatever you call it. Tell him to stop smoking, in short, and I will turn in with him. But I don't fancy having a man smoking in bed with me. It's dangerous. Besides, I ain't insured. They tell Queequeg this. He complies, rolling into bed on one side as much as to say, I won't touch a leg of ye. Good night, landlord, said I. You may go. Last line of the chapter. I turned in and never slept better in my life. And in the next chapter, we begin to watch this relationship, the fraternalism that begins to come in here. And it's done in very subtle ways, that they sleep together under this counterpane, and it's quilted, and you really get a sense that the pattern here, it's a sort of woven tissues together, warp and woof, and you get a feeling that all of this is a kind of symbol for these two men who were becoming united as soul brothers of sorts themselves. And he wakes up and he feels that Queequeg's arm is around him. It's a fine sequence, and later in the text, still very early, it's going to be developed still further about how Queequeg really is a man whom he learns to admire. He compares him in a very well-known passage to George Washington. Looks at his face, he says, it reminded me of Washington's head, as seen in the popular bust. It had the same long, regularly graded, retreating slope from above the brows, which were likewise very projecting. He said, Queequeg was George Washington cannibalistically developed. Okay? And they share a bed and they talk. They smoke their pipe. We sat exchanging puffs from the wild pipe of his. He seemed to take to me quite as naturally and unbiddenly as I to him. And when our smoke was over, he pressed his forehead against mine, clasped me around the waist, and said, henceforth we were married. Meaning, in his country's phrase, we were bosom friends. He would gladly die for me, if need be. It also turns out that he has his little idol, this little figure that he worships, and in a wonderful passage, he signals to Ishmael to do likewise. And Ishmael says, I'm a Christian. It says it to us. But then he realizes that, after all, this man is God-fearing, and here we are living together. And so I'd want him to worship my God. I guess it's time for me to worship his. And so he salams, and he does all the things that he's supposed to do for this little icon. There's a lot of economy here. This is multicultural Melville again. This is Melville taking this large delegation of people, in this case, this strange man who comes to us initially as totally other, exotic, threatening, dangerous, and it ends up being a kind of fraternal union of the two of them. That sense of connectedness is what, of course, this text is going to develop further and further and further. In one of the very rich passages in the text, we hear about monkey rope bonds that connect people. And it has to do with one of the whales that's been caught, and the whale is suspended in the water still, and the harpooners are going down. They're being held by ropes, going down and cutting and stripping the whale. And Queequeg is the harpooner down there, and Ishmael is holding the rope, which is tied to him, and that's called the monkey rope bonds. So that for better or for worse, we two for the time were wedded, and you get the same notion as we had with the two of them in bed. And should poor Queequeg sink to rise no more, then both usage and honor demanded that instead of cutting the cord, it should drag me down in his wake, so that an elongated Siamese ligature united us. They become Siamese twins, and if he goes under, I go under. Queequeg was my own inseparable twin brother. Here comes Melville. All right, that's already a fascinating notation. Here is the Melville that I want really to get across to you, is the way in which this condition is now going to be unpacked for all of the philosophical richness that it has. So strongly and metaphysically did I conceive of my situation then, that while earnestly watching his motions, I seemed distinctly to perceive that my own individuality was now merged in a joint stock company of two, that my free will had received a mortal wound. And yet, still further pondering, while I jerked him now and then from between the whale and the ship, which would threaten to jam him, still further pondering, you can hear the brain working. You can watch this thing being transformed. I saw that this situation of mine was the precise situation of every mortal that breathes. Here we go, the universal analogy now. Only in most cases, he, one way or other, has this Siamese connection with the plurality of other mortals. If your banker breaks, you snap. All right, there's a bond between you and your banker. He breaks, you snap. If your apothecary by mistake sends you poison in your pills, you die. All of this is coming from being bound by this rope with Queequeg and realizing this is the structure of life. This is the interdependence of the ecosystem that connects us to all. We are all, in a sense, threads in a loom. And you pull one and they all move. True, you may say that by exceeding caution you may possibly escape these and multitudinous other evil chances of life. But handle Queequeg's monkey rope heedfully as I would, sometimes he jerked it so that I came very near sliding overboard, nor could I possibly forget. Do what I would, I only had the management of one end of it. This is Emersonian. Emerson said, take the facts that look homely, that are part of your immediate experience, and unpack them. Show the spirit that's in them. Show everything that shines and shimmers in them if you were a poet. Whitman is going to do that. Melville's doing it here. The situation of two men connected by a monkey rope begins to shimmer forth as a kind of parable about human connectedness, human interdependence. That's the Melville move, is to be able to show the spirit that is in things, to take homely notions, homely facts of life on a whaling ship, and transform them in front of our eyes. One of the most lovely parallels to this is what Melville calls fast fish and loose fish. Fast and loose fish are terms that are routinely used or were on a whaling boat. One, a fast fish belongs to the party fast to it. In other words, it's your fish if you've got it. Two, a loose fish is fair game for anyone who can soonest catch it. Sounds simple enough. Here's what Melville's going to do with it. Is it not a saying in everyone's mouth that possession is half of the law? That is, regardless of how the thing came into possession, but often possession is the whole of the law. What are the sinews and souls of Russian serfs and Russian slaves but fast fish? They belong to their rulers. They can't move. Whereof possession is the whole of the law. What to the rapacious landlord is the widow's last mite but a fast fish? What is yonder undetected villain's marble mansion with a doorplate for a waif? What is that but a fast fish? Fast fish leads him to a meditation on how the world is governed by people controlling others. This is the property ownership of human beings. This is the way the capitalist system works. It's the way political systems work. Fast fish are everywhere. What about loose fish? He says that's even more widely so, internationally, universally applicable. What was America in 1492 but a loose fish, in which Columbus struck the Spanish standard by way of waifing it for his royal master and mistress? What was Poland to the Tsar? What was Greece to the Turk? What was India to England? All loose fish. What are the rights of man, liberties of the world, but loose fish? Men's opinions and minds, but loose fish. What about the principle of religious belief in them? Loose fish. What if to the ostentatious smuggling verbalists, the writers, are the thoughts of thinkers but loose fish? I plunder, I pillage, I take from everywhere I read loose fish, and I make my book. What is the great globe itself but a loose fish? And what are you, reader, but a loose fish? And a fast fish, too. Here again, we see that universalizing strain, strength, energy in Melville, in which the very terms of the trade become capacious ways of illuminating our transactions with each other. Loose fish has to do with all of the ingenuity of the writer. Loose fish has to do with our own availability. If you're not available, you can't be a reader. He's grabbing you, harpooning you, making you his. You are loose fish if you read. Thank you.